Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Paul's letter to the Colossians. We're going to take a look at 3:20 through 23. We're going to take a look at the ethic of the household code that Paul teaches here. Let's go to block 1. We'll begin with the text. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you, but in order to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and with a reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as if you were working for the Lord, not for human masters. And that's a good conclusive statement for all of the household ethic, really. Do everything as if for the Lord. Let's look at the pillar commentary in block 2. We begin with verse 20. Obey your parents. And it actually reads, children, obey your parents, kata panta, in all things, for this is pleasing to the Lord. This is eurestas, acceptable, fully agreeable to the Lord. The emphasis is on the reciprocal nature of household relationships, and the Lordship of Christ is the touchstone for the obedience of children. Everything with regard to the household code falls under the Lordship of Christ. And then verse 21, parents, do not embitter your children. Pateres me epithedzete ta tekna humon. And it reads, fathers, do not provoke your children. And it's a erethidzo, do not provoke to spiritlessness. In other words, it's okay to discipline your children. Don't break their spirit. Don't break their spirit. And pateres doesn't simply mean father. It really does refer to both parents. In the Septuagint, erethidzo is used for rebellious and stubborn. So stubborn and spiritless seems to be the best translation here. You don't want to break a child's spirit. Obviously, you do not. Let's go on to block 3 and take a look at 22 and 23. Verse 22, obey with reverence for the Lord. And its slaves, in all things, obey the earthly masters. Hupakuo is the verb used here, and it means, akuo is the Greek concept for hearing, and hupa means under, so it means to hear under. In other words, to hear as a subordinate. Really an unusual compound verb there, but obey is literally hear under, to hear under. The household included domestic slaves. But look at this. Paul addresses domestic slaves as fellow citizens of God's kingdom. So yes, they have a job as a domestic servant, but they are fellow citizens. Paul addresses the slaves as fellow citizens of God's kingdom. Both slave and master fall under the lordship of Christ. Masters here are the Kurios kata sarka, masters according to the flesh. So, in all things, if you are a domestic servant, hupakuo, obey, hear under as a subordinate, and obey, because you are also fellow citizens of God's kingdom. And everyone falls under the lordship of Christ. And verse 33 summarizes basically everything concerning a work ethic. Do all work as if working for the Lord. Whatever you do, ha poiete. Whatever you do, ha poiete. Ergadzomai has ek psyches. Work as if you were working from the inner self, as if it was an inner concern driven by the inner self. And psyche is that inner self, distinguished from the pneuma. So the psyche is the inner self, but it is not the essential spiritual self. That is the pneuma. So you've got pneuma and psyche, but pneuma is the inner self. And whatever you do it as if being motivated from the inner self. Hos-To-Kurios, as unto the Lord. Uk anthropos, not mankind, as if you were working unto the Lord and not unto mankind. The focus on Christ is the motivation for all of our labor. Regardless of what that labor is, the inner focus on Christ is our motivation. It is our phronesis. It is our mindset. Remember Paul's term, phronesis, mindset. Our spiritual mindset is to be focused on Christ, and that becomes the motivation for any of our labor, regardless of what that labor is. Our inner self is motivated by a spiritual mindset that focuses on Christ and Christ's kingdom and the history of Christ, within which we have been lifted up and now are a part of. As believers, we are enjoined in the eschatological history of Christ that is moving toward the eschaton. Therefore, we live as eschatological selves, as members of an eschatological history, as members of a Christological history. We are taken up into the history of Christ. So all that we do, our inner self, our spiritual mindset, our phronesis, is to be focused on Christ. Our motivation is our inner focus on Christ. It is our motivation, our genuine motivation. So it's an interesting lesson on the household code that Paul teaches, and he gives us a new concept in this group of scriptures. He uses the concept hupakuo in verse 20. If you go to block 2, verse 20, he uses hupakuo, and akuo is the Greek concept for to hear. Hupa is the prefix in Greek meaning under. So hupakuo is a compound verb meaning to hear under. In other words, to hear and obey as a subordinate. It's a term that gets introduced here by Paul, And again it is introduced in verse 20, verse 20, verse 20, and verse 22. Down in block 3, verse 22 also uses hupakuo. Akuo, to hear, and the prefix hupa, meaning under, to hear as a subordinate, and to obey as a subordinate. So Paul uses it in verse 20 and verse 22, but the guiding touchstone for the verb hupakoo is kurios, lordship, and it is block 23, Hos-To-Kurios. Do everything as unto the Lord. Do everything as unto the Lord. And do all your work, Hos ek psyches, from the inner self. We are to do all that we do as motivated by our spiritual inner self. An inner self imprinted with the Lordship of Christ. As believers, our inner self, our inner being, is an imprinted, that's tupos in Greek. Our inner self has been tupos imprinted with the personhood of Christ. And it's that image of the Roman coin. When they would press the image of Caesar onto the coin, the Greek verb there is tupos. And Paul frequently talked about imprinting the soul, imprinting the heart with Christ. And he uses tupos. So our inner self is tupos imprinted with the purpose and the person and the identity of Christ. And he becomes the motivation of the inner self. And so we do all things Hos-To-Kurios. We do all things as unto the Lord, and we do all things as ergodzomai hos ek psyches, as working from a motivation from the inner self. Regardless as to what our work is, the fundamental motivation that motivates everything we do is the inner self imprinted by the Lordship of Christ. And in other verses, Paul, of course, uses the verb phronesis, or the noun phronesis, the verb phroneo, for spiritual mind set, which motivates the inner self. And that phroneo, or phronesis, mind set, is a mindset imprinted, tupos imprinted, with the personhood and the lordship of Christ. Our inner person is imprinted with the person of Christ, the member of the eternal Godhead. And how do we know that that occurs? Because we've been given the promise of an indwelling Holy Spirit, and it is the indwelling Holy Spirit that does the actual tupos imprinting of our inner self. That is a work of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit tupos imprints our inner self with the personhood of Christ. We use the word personhood here. So the person of the Holy Spirit indwells us and imprints the inner self with the personhood of Christ, which in turn lifts us spiritually into the history of Christ, which is moving toward the eschaton. Therefore, we live eschatological lives. We are identified as eschatological beings, and as eschatological beings, we live unto the Lord. Hos-To-Kurios. We live Hos-To-Kurios, as unto the Lord. Not according to secularism, not according to anthropos, but Hos-To-Kurios, as unto the Lord. That is the key to our motivation. All in all, it's a very, very powerful lesson. It gave us an introduction to a new compound verb, hupakuo, to hear under. In other words, to listen and obey as a subordinate, hupakuo, to listen and obey as a subordinate, and Ha-Ta-Kurios, do all things as unto the Lord, and ergadzomai has ek psyches, and do everything as motivated from the inner self. Do everything as motivated from the inner self, and inner self imprinted, tupos imprinted, with the personhood of Christ. That wraps up 3:20 through 23. We will continue in Colossians in our next lesson.